Well, good morning. Happy Boxing Day, everybody. I hope everybody had a safe and happy Christmas with friends and loved ones yesterday. And here we are, Boxing Day. Now today, I'm planning on doing something a little different. I was just going to put together a short message, but then I came across this story. This story was actually written by Oscar Wilde in his publication, A House of Pomegranates. Now, The House of Pomegranates is just a collection of short stories by Oscar Wilde, published in 1891. The title of this story is The Young King. Now, I found this just by chance as I was going through preparing Advent services, and I thought, man, this is a fitting story for Boxing Day. We're celebrating the birth of a king. This story tells about the coronation of a king. So this is the story. Here we go. The king-to-be flung himself down on the soft cushions of his embroidered couch. He could not stop thinking of what he was going to wear at his coronation. A robe of tissued gold, the ruby-studded crown, and the scepter with its rows and rings of pearls. Months ago, he was but a mere shepherd in a remote part of the kingdom. It was only when the old king was on his deathbed that the royal council learned that this shepherd was in fact the heir to the throne. The boy's mother, who was also the old king's daughter, had died shortly after childbirth, and no one knew who the boy's father was. Rather than bring embarrassment to the throne, the boy was quietly given to a poor couple who had no children of their own. But before the old king died, he had this 16-year-old shepherd brought before him and acknowledged him as his one true heir. Perhaps because the young king knew all too well what it meant to wear a shepherd's robe, that he could not wait to wear the robe of gold and a crown of rubies while holding a scepter of pearls. Each had been designed by the most famous artisans of the time. He had given orders to the artists that they were to work night and day to make them, and the whole world was searched for the jewels that would be worthy of this work. He imagined himself standing at the high altar of the cathedral in the royal dress of a king. A smile lingered on the boy's face and lit up his dark woodland eyes. He touched a bell, and his attendants entered and disrobed him with much ceremony, pouring rose water over his hands and strewing flowers on his pillow. A few moments later, he left the room and fell asleep. As he slept, he had a dream, and this was the dream. He thought that he was standing in a long, low attic, filled with a whirl and clatter of many looms. A few rays of daylight peered in through the grated windows, and it showed him the gaunt figures of the weavers bending over their looms. Pale and sickly-looking children worked alongside the atoms. Their faces were pinched with famine, and their hands shook and trembled. Some gaunt woman sat at a table sewing. A horrible odor filled the place, and the air was foul and heavy, and the walls dripped with damp. The young king went over to one of the weavers, stood by him, and watched him. The weaver looked at him angrily and said, "Why are you watching me? Are you a spy sent on by our master?" "Who is your master?" asked the young king. "Our master," cried the weaver bitterly, "is a man like myself. The only difference is this. He wears fine clothes while I wear rags. And while I am weak from hunger, his stomach aches from eating too much." The young king answered, "But the land is free. You are not slaves." But the weaver replied, "We must work to live, and they give us such few wages that we die. We work for them all day long, and they heap up their gold. Our children fade away before their time, and the faces of those we love become hard and evil. We tread out the grapes, but another drinks our wine. We grow the corn, and our plates are empty. We have chains, though no eyes can see them. We are slaves, though some call us free." He turned away, scowling, and returned to his work. The young king saw that the fabric was threaded with a thread of gold. A great terror seized the young king, and he said to the weaver, "What robe is this that you are weaving?" "It is the robe for the coronation of the young king." And he answered, "What is it to you?" And the young king, with a loud cry, woke up. He was in his own chamber, and through the windows he saw the honey-colored moon still hanging in the dusky sky. He fell asleep again and had another dream, and this was the second dream. He thought he was lying on the deck of a huge galley that was being rowed by 100 slaves, each slave chained to his neighbor. The hot sun beat brightly upon them, and the sailors ran up and down the gangway, lashing them with leather whips. They stretched out their long arms and pulled on the heavy oars through the water, and salt spray flew from the blades. At last they reached a little bay, and they began to measure the depths of the waters. As soon as they cast anchor, they hauled down the sail, and the sailors went into the hold and brought up a long rope ladder with heavy weights on the bottom. The master of the galley threw it over the side, attaching the tops to the ship. Then the sailors seized the youngest of the slaves. They knocked off his shackles and filled his nostrils and nose with wax. They tied a big stone around his waist, and he crept warily down the ladder and disappeared into the sea. A few bubbles arose where he sank. After some time, the diver arose out of the water, clung and panting to the ladder, with a pearl in his right hand. The sailor seized it from him and thrust him back down. Again and again he came up. Each time he did so, he brought with him a beautiful pearl. The master of the galley weighed them and put them into a little bag of green leather. Then the diver came up for the last time, and the pearl that he brought with him was more beautiful than all the pearls of the world, for it was shaped like a full moon, and whiter than the morning star. But his face was strangely pale, and as he fell upon the deck, blood gushed from his ears and nostrils. He quivered for a little, and then was still. The sailors shrugged their shoulders and threw his body overboard. The master of the galley laughed and reached out and took the pearl, and when he saw it, he pressed it to his forehead and bowed. "It shall be," he said, "for the scepter of the young king." And he made a sign for the sailors to draw up anchor. When the young king heard this, he gave a cry and woke up. And through the windows he saw the long gray fingers of dawn clutching at the fading stars. He fell asleep again, and another dream he had, and this was the third and final dream. At the outskirts of a deep jungle, he saw an immense multitude of men working in the bed of a dried-up river. They swarmed up the rocks like ants. They dug deep pits into the ground and went down into them. Some of them split open the rocks with great axes. Others grabbed in the sand. They tore up the cactus by its roots and trampled its scarlet blossoms. They hurried about, calling to each other, and no one was idle. As the young king watched, sickness struck down the workers. Chills, fevers, and plague brought death until no one was alive. And the young king wept and said, "Who were these workers? What were they searching for?" And a voice behind him answered, "For rubies for the king's crown." And the young king turned around and saw a man holding a mirror of silver. He grew pale and asked, "For what king?" The man answered, "Look into this mirror and you will see him." He looked into the mirror, seeing his own face. He gave a great cry and woke again. The bright sunlight was shining into the room, and from the trees of the garden the birds were singing. High officers came in and bowed before him. The attendants brought in his robe of tissued gold, and they set the crown and scepter before him. The young king looked at them, and they were beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever seen. But he remembered his dreams, and he said to his officials, "Take these things away, for I will not wear them." The nobles were amazed, and some of them laughed, for they thought he was joking. But he spoke sternly to them again and said, Take these things away and hide them from me. Though it is the day of my coronation, I will not wear them. For the loom of sorrow and by the white bands of pain has this robe been woven. There is blood in the heart of the ruby and death in the heart of the pearl. And he told them of his 3 dreams. When the nobles heard them, they looked at each other and whispered, saying, Surely he is mad. For what is a dream but a dream, and a vision but a vision? They're not real things that we should pay attention to them. What do we have to do with the lives of those who work for us? Should people not eat bread till they have seen the farmer's hired hands? The young king commanded them all to leave, except one attendant, whom he kept as his companion. When he had bathed himself in clear water, he opened up the great painted chest, and from it he took his leather robe and rough sheepskin cloak that he had worn as a shepherd. He put these on, and in his hands he took a crude shepherd's staff. The little attendant opened his big blue eyes in wonder and said to him, My lord, I see your robe and your scepter, but where is your crown? The young king plucked a spray of wild briar that was climbing over the balcony, and he bent it and made a circle of it and put it on his head. This shall be my crown, he answered. Dressed like that, he left his chamber for the great hall, where the nobles were waiting for him. The nobles made merry. Some of them cried out to him, My lord, the people wait for their king, and you show them a beggar? Others grew angry and said, He brings shame upon our state, and is unworthy to be our master. He did not answer them, but went straight down the bright staircase, and out through the great gates of bronze, and mounted upon his horse, and rode towards the cathedral, the little attendant running alongside him. And the people laughed and said, Is this the king's fool who is riding by? And they made fun of him. He pulled the horse's reins and said, No, I am the king. And he told them of his 3 dreams. A man came out of the crowd and spoke bitterly to him. He said, Sir, do you not know that out of the luxury of the rich comes the life of the poor? Your vices give us bread. To work for hard masters is bitter, but to have no master to work for is more bitter still. Do you think that the ravens will feed us? What cure do you have for these things? Go back to your palace, put on your purple and fine linens. What do you have to do with us and what we suffer? Are not the rich and the poor brothers? Asked the young king. Yes, answered the man, and the name of the rich brother is Cain. The young king's eyes filled with tears, and he rode on through the crowd, listening to the murmurs of the people. The little attendant grew afraid and left him. When he reached the great doors of the cathedral, the soldiers thrust their spears out and said, What do you want? No one enters by this door but the king. His face flushed with anger. He said to them, I am the king, and waved the spears aside and entered. When the old bishop saw him coming in his shepherd's dress, he rose in wonder from his throne and went to meet him. And he said to him, My son, is this the king's apparel? With what crown shall I crown you? With what scepter shall I place in your hands? Surely this should be a day of joy, not a day of humiliation. And the young king replied, Should joy wear what grief has fashioned? And he told him of his 3 dreams. When the bishop had heard them, he said, My son, I am an old man, and in the winter of my days, and I know that many evil things are done in the wide world. Can you robbers, kidnappers, lions, boars, pirates, lepers, and beggars, can you change all these things? Will you take the leper into your bed, and the beggar set the beggar at your table? Shall the lion follow you, and the wild boar obey you? Ride back to your palace and make your face glad, and put on the robe of a king. With a crown of gold I will crown you, and a scepter of pearl I will place in your hand. As for your dreams, think no more of them. The world's sorrow is too heavy for one heart to suffer. And the young king replied, Do you say these things in your house? and he walked past the bishop, and up the steps of the altar, and stood before the cross. And then he knelt before the cross, and the great candles burned brightly, and he bowed his head in prayer. Suddenly, there was a wild commotion that came from out in the streets. In entered the nobles with drawn swords and shields of polished steel. They cried, "Where is this dreamer of dreams? Where is this king who dressed like a beggar? The boy who brings shame on our state? Surely we will kill him, for he is unworthy to rule over us." And the young king bowed his head again in prayer and prayed. And when he finished his prayer, he rose up and turned around and looked at them sadly. And through the painted windows, sunlight came streaming upon him. The sunbeams wove round him a tissued robe that was more beautiful than the robe that had been made for that day. The dead staff blossomed. It bore lilies whiter than the pearls. The dry thorns blossomed, and it bore roses redder than the rubies. He stood there in the king's raiment, and the glory of God filled the place. In the stately attire of a king, he stood before them. The organ pealed out its music, and the trumpeters blew their trumpets, and the singing boys sang. The people fell on their knees in awe. The nobles put their swords away and bowed down, and the bishop's face grew pale, and his hands trembled. "Someone greater than I has crowned you," he cried, and he knelt before him. And the young king came down from the high altar, passed home through the midst of the people, but no one dared to look upon his face, for it was the face of an angel. I think that is a very fitting story there for this time, when we just celebrated the birth of our own king. I wish everybody a very happy Christmas season. Remain safe, and hopefully soon we will be able to join together in worship and celebrate this wonderful king. God bless everybody. Amen.